The night was quiet, too quiet. A black man, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, walked to his car in a dimly lit parking lot. He had just wrapped up a long day, but before he could even reach for his keys, flashing red and blue lights cut through the darkness. A police cruiser screeched to a stop. An officer, already on edge, stepped out, his hand hovering over his holster. "Hands where I can see them," he barked. Confused but calm, the man slowly raised his hands. "Is there a problem, officer?" The officer's eyes narrowed. He had seen this scenario too many times, or so he thought. A black man in a nice suit, in the wrong part of town? It didn't add up in his mind. Without hesitation, he grabbed the man's arm and forced him against the car, patting him down aggressively. "You fit the description of a suspect," the officer snapped, tightening the cuffs around the man's wrists. But then something changed. The man's expression remained steady, almost amused. "You might want to check my ID," he said coolly. The officer scoffed but reached into the man's jacket pocket. What he pulled out made his blood run cold. A badge. A federal badge. His hands trembled as he read the words, "FBI Special Agent." In that moment, the weight of his mistake hit him like a ton of bricks. His prejudice had blinded him, and now, the man he had just humiliated had the power to turn his world upside down. And that's when everything took an unexpected turn. The officer's breath hitched as he stared at the FBI badge in his trembling hands. His grip on the cuffs loosened slightly, but not enough to let the man go. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him like a vice. He had acted on instinct, on bias, and now, standing before him, was not a suspect, but a federal agent. The agent remained still, his face unreadable. He didn't lash out. He didn't demand an apology. Instead, he simply watched, as if waiting to see how the officer would handle his own mistake. A tense silence stretched between them before the officer finally spoke, his voice laced with uncertainty. This has to be some kind of mistake." The agent's gaze didn't waver. "Oh, there's a mistake, all right. But it's not mine." The officer swallowed hard. He felt the weight of the body cam on his chest, recording every second of this nightmare. He had assumed, judged, and acted before even asking for identification. And now, the man he had handcuffed could ruin him with a single report. Another officer, younger and visibly nervous, stepped out of the squad car. He had been watching the entire interaction unfold, but now, realizing what had just happened, he hesitated. Officer, is everything okay?" The lead officer's mind raced. If he admitted his mistake now, what would happen? Suspension? Termination? The headlines flashed through his mind like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. "Racist cop arrests FBI agent." His stomach twisted. He couldn't afford this. But before he could respond, the agent's calm voice cut through the tension. "What's your name, officer?" The question hit harder than it should have. The officer hesitated before answering, suddenly aware of how the power dynamic had shifted. "Collins," he finally muttered. The agent nodded slightly, committing the name to memory. "Well, Collins, I suggest you remove these cuffs." Collins hesitated, but with a glance at his partner, who was shifting uncomfortably, he knew he had no choice. With a reluctant sigh, he reached for his keys and unlocked the cuffs, stepping back as the agent rubbed his wrists. "You have no idea how bad you just messed up," the younger officer whispered to Collins, barely audible. Collins clenched his jaw. He knew. The agent took his time, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off the weight of the encounter. "I'd love to say this is surprising," he finally said, slipping his badge back into his pocket. "But we both know it's not." Collins opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The agent took a step closer, lowering his voice. "The question is, what happens next?" Collins tensed. "What do you mean, teaming?" The agent didn't blink. "Do you go back to your station and file a false report to cover yourself? Do you make up some excuse to justify what just happened? Or, he let the words hang in the air. Collins felt a cold sweat creep up his neck. He didn't have an answer. The agent exhaled slowly, as if measuring his next words. You assume you know who people are before you even hear them speak. That's dangerous, Collins. For everyone. The younger officer shifted uneasily. Sir, is there anything we can do to? The agent held up a hand, silencing him. His attention was fully on Collins. I could report this. I should report this. Collins' heart pounded. But the agent studied him for a long moment before shaking his head. You'll find out soon enough. And with that, he turned, opened his car door, and drove off into the night, leaving Collins standing in the glow of red and blue lights, his stomach in knots. The younger officer broke the silence. What do we do now? Collins didn't have an answer. But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Not even close. Collins stood frozen, his mind racing as the FBI agent's car disappeared into the night. The air felt heavier than before, thick with the weight of everything that had just transpired. He had screwed up badly. And now, there was nothing he could do but wait for the consequences, wait for the fallout, wait for the moment when his entire career might come crashing down around him. The younger officer beside him, still visibly shaken, finally broke the silence. Are you going to tell the captain? Collins didn't answer right away. He couldn't. His gut told him that if he reported this incident honestly, it could be the end of his career. But if he tried to cover it up, there was no telling what the agent might do. FBI agents didn't just let things slide. They had power, real power. Collins knew that if the agent wanted to, he could make sure Collins never wore a badge again. His jaw tightened. We don't say anything unless we have to. The younger officer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. You really think that's a good idea? Collins shot him a sharp look. You want to write a report about how I illegally detained an FBI agent? You want to be dragged into an IA investigation? The officer looked away, swallowing hard. I don't want this to come back worse later. Collins exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. It was too late for second-guessing. The only thing he could do now was hope that the agent wasn't the type to hold grudges. But something told him this wasn't over. The following days were torture. Every time Collins stepped into the precinct, he felt like a man walking toward his own execution. Every time the captain called his name, his stomach clenched, half expecting to be pulled into the office and told that internal affairs was waiting for him. But nothing happened. No reports. No calls. No one seemed to know anything. Maybe, just maybe, the agent had let it go. Then, on a rainy Thursday evening, just as Collins was about to end his shift, his luck ran out. The captain's voice rang out from across the bullpen. Collins! My office. Now. Every officer in the room turned to look. Collins kept his face neutral, but his pulse was hammering. He forced himself to move casually, like nothing was wrong, but the moment he stepped into the captain's office and saw who was waiting inside, he knew it was over. Sitting in one of the chairs, calm as ever, was the agent. Collins barely had time to process what was happening before the captain shut the door and crossed his arms. You want to tell me why the hell I had to find out from an FBI agent that one of my officers arrested him without cause? Collins felt the blood drain from his face. He looked at the agent, searching for any sign of what was coming next, but the man's expression was unreadable. The captain's voice was sharp. Well. Collins hesitated. There was no point in lying now. I made a mistake. The captain scoffed. That's putting it lightly. He turned to the agent. I'm assuming you're here because you want something done about it. The agent finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. That depends. Collins stiffened. On what? What? The agent studied him for a moment. On whether or not you actually learn from this. Collins frowned. What's that supposed to mean? The agent leaned forward slightly. It means I've seen officers like you before, Collins. Quick to judge. quick to assume. But what happens next? Do you keep pretending you don't have a problem? Do you keep making the same mistakes until one day, it's not an undercover federal agent you're arresting, it's someone who doesn't make it out alive? The words hit like a punch to the gut. Collins knew exactly what the agent was implying. And the worst part, he wasn't wrong. Collins took a slow breath, forcing himself to meet the agent's gaze. So what do you want from me? The agent didn't look away. Accountability. Collins frowned. What does that mean? The agent exhaled, then turned to the captain. I don't want him fired. The captain raised an eyebrow. You don't? No, the agent said. I want him trained. Collins' stomach twisted. Trained? The agent nodded. Bias training. Community outreach. Real education, not just a mandatory video in a training room. If he screws up again after that, then yeah, he shouldn't be wearing a badge. But I want him to understand why what he did was wrong. Otherwise, firing him just means another guy like him takes his place, and nothing changes. Collins didn't know whether to be relieved or humiliated. The captain considered the proposal, then finally nodded. Fine. Collins, you're on mandatory training. Effective immediately. Collins swallowed hard but nodded. He had no choice. The agent stood, adjusting his jacket. I'll be watching, Collins. You'll either prove me right or prove me wrong. With that, he walked out, leaving Collins standing there, the weight of everything crashing down on him. The training wasn't easy. At first, Collins approached it like a punishment, something to get through so he could move on. But the more he listened, the more he saw, the harder it became to ignore the truth. He sat in community meetings where people shared their fears about law enforcement. He watched body cam footage of stops that had gone horribly wrong, situations that had started just like his own encounter with the agent, but had ended in tragedy. He spoke with officers who had been in his position before and had been forced to confront the biases they hadn't even realized they had. And slowly, something shifted. He started recognizing his own patterns, the assumptions he had made for years without questioning them. He realized how many times he had treated people differently based on nothing more than his own ingrained prejudices. It wasn't easy to admit, but once he did, he couldn't ignore it. Weeks passed, and by the time he returned to active duty, he wasn't the same officer who had thrown cuffs on an innocent man in a parking lot. One night, months after the incident, he was patrolling alone when he spotted a black teenager sitting on the curb outside a gas station. The boy was fidgeting, looking nervous. Collins' old instincts kicked in the urge to question him, to assume something was off. But then, he stopped himself. Instead of reaching for his radio, he stepped out of the car and walked over. Hey, you okay? The kid hesitated, clearly expecting trouble. Yeah. My phone died. I was supposed to get a ride. Collins nodded. You need to use mine? The boy blinked, surprised. Yeah. That'd be cool. Collins handed over his phone, watching as the kid quickly dialed a number. As he waited, he realized something. A year ago, he wouldn't have done this. He would have assumed the worst. Now he saw things differently. And as the boy thanked him and walked away, Collins exhaled, knowing this was the real test. Maybe the agent had been right about him after all.